Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. I have a returning guest, my friend, Dr. Paul Reeve. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you, Richard. It's an honor to be with you again.
Paul was on the podcast way back in episode 278, and he is now on the podcast to talk about a new book that's at Deseret Book. It's called Let's Talk About Race and the Priesthood. And it's just a terrific book. In fact, listeners, this is the first time I was almost late to start a podcast because I was consumed with one of the chapters of the book. And then I looked at the clock and I thought, oh no, we need to do a podcast about this book. Just a little bit about Paul. Paul Reeve is the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he teaches courses on Utah history, Mormon history, and the history of the U.S. West. His book, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, has received multiple awards, and that's what Podcast 278 was about, listeners. He is the project manager and general editor of a digital database, Century of Black Mormons, designed to identify all known people of Black African descent baptized in the faith between 1830 and 1930. This database is found at centuryofblackmormons.org. Paul and his wife Beth are the parents of 6 children. And I believe you got your PhD in history from the University of Utah, where you're at now.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I'm going to let Paul talk about this, but it's kind of a book that's talks about phase 1 is universal priesthood and temples, where Black Latter-day Saints had full access to the priesthood and temple. And then phase 2, segregated priesthood and temples. And then phase 3, and I love the way you've named this, a return to racial inclusivity. And if you're not familiar, listeners, with the Let's Talk About, it's a series, and maybe Paul will talk about this at Deseret Book. Let's Talk About series includes small, approachable books on important Latter-day Saint topics. Each one is written by a trusted, faithful scholar who thoroughly explains the topic, including key issues to consider, designed for people who have sincere questions and are seeking answers. This series provides access to some of the best thinking in the church. And then Darius Gray, your friend and somebody I deeply admire, and a really friend for the whole church, writes the foreword. And Richard E. Turley Jr., former church history historian and recorder, writes, church history, church leaders have spoken boldly, unequivocally condemning racism, but some members still cling to false traditions of the past. In this slender volume, historian W. Paul Reeve shows how these traditions developed and why they should be thoroughly abandoned. So with that introduction, listeners, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Reeve. I'll probably call him Paul the rest of the podcast, just to talk about whatever he wants to talk about this book. But I think one of the things he's particularly trying to do, Paul and I are both white, is lift the voices of Black Latter-day Saints. And you're particularly good at that, is using your privilege and your scholarly insights to bring voice to this wonderful group of people. So take it away, Paul.
Yeah, well, thank you, Richard. I love that you started out by just attuning the listeners to the structure of the book, because if people come away with just that new knowledge, I think the book will be a success. Simply the fact that a lot of Latter-day Saints today even continue to think that the racial priesthood and temple restrictions were in place from the beginning. They originated with the church and existed until 1978. And what I hope people appreciate, and what I love about Deseret Book being willing to publish this, is simply the fact that this is a historical study that traces the racial priesthood and temple restrictions over time. this is what historians pay attention to. We pay attention to change over time. And, from the get-go, I said to Deseret Book, look, you have to understand this is how I have come to understand the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions, that the first couple of decades, there were no restrictions. And in fact, that's what the evidence points to. And then we have in fits and starts the racial restrictions developing across the course of the 19th century and becoming solidified in place by the beginning of the 20th century. So then 1978 is not something new. It, in fact, returns us to our universal roots and reconciles us to our founding scriptures. I think that's a really important point to make, is just simply the fact that the racial restrictions themselves are in violation of the founding doctrines of the faith. And so I simply structure the book that way and try to lay out the evidence, in that manner. And, you mentioned the Let's Talk About series. I like this series simply because it's pitched at a general Latter-day Saint audience, but they asked me as a scholar to include the same scholarly apparatus I would include, if I were writing for an academic audience. In other words, what are the sources? Here are the footnotes. It's documented, in other words. And people can, look at the footnotes and see the primary sources that the evidence is based on. So that's sort of a basic overview and in-introduction to the book. And thrilled that Deseret Book was willing to engage at this level with this volume. And other volumes in the series are also really nicely done.
Why is it we're kind of past 1978, so we're kind of back to where we were. Why is it important to talk about this or write about it? Can't we just move on? And I know sort of how you might answer that and how our Black Latter-day Saint friends might answer that, but answer that for us, Paul.
Yeah, well, so we have been called by President Nelson and President Oaks to root out racism in the last couple of years. If we've been paying attention at all to the leadership, this has been a pretty consistent drumbeat over even the last 10 or 15 years, and only increased of late because of the increase in racism. So how do you root out racism if you're unwilling to examine its roots? And that's one of the points that I make in the conclusion, right? So I'm a historian. I think history is a part of the answer. Why not just move forward? Well, because history has something to teach us. We have to be willing to look at what racism looked like in the past to be able to understand it in the present and to formulate a better future. How do we lead out in abandoning prejudice if we don't understand what it looked like in our own past? In that case, I see history as a moral guidebook of sorts. It can help us to learn from the wisdom as well as the mistakes of the past and help us to chart a better future, but also a willingness to stand in places of empathy in the present, right? So in my estimation, we cannot do what we've been called to do by Latter-day Saint leaders without confessing the past, coming to terms with it, being open and honest about it, not deny and defend it, but actually come to terms with its meaning in the present and use that as a guide to move forward in positive directions. So, no one says, well, let's forget about Joseph Smith and the martyrdom or the Latter-day Saints being expelled from Missouri under threat of extermination. We engage in church history. It's taught at BYU. We pull handcarts to remember the sacrifices of white Latter-day Saint handcart pioneers. So why is it then we would suggest that, Black Latter-day Saint history we should just forget about? Black Latter-day Saint history is Latter-day Saint history. It's a part of the Latter-day Saint story. So it needs to be included. The story isn't complete until all members of the body of Christ are represented. And Black Latter-day Saints have been a part of this story from 1830 to the present, including Black priesthood holders. Just saying, okay, let's move forward. Then repentance isn't, we haven't gone through the act of repentance. We haven't actually confessed and engaged with what the past looks like so that we can, in fact, move forward and not be hobbled by our racial past. Ignoring it doesn't work. Going silent on it doesn't work.
Thank you for that. It's really your time to talk about whatever you want to talk about. But if I were to ask you a question, I'd probably ask you to talk about these 3 sections. If you want to structure it that way or wherever you want to go, I'd love to talk about just the historical facts. You're a historian of that there was no restriction. And then this is where I got lost track of time, is when I was reading chapter 11, Orson Pratt and a Premortal Explanation, which is your work to try to figure out how this different theories came into our church around the racial restriction. And that was fascinating to me. There wasn't just one idea. There were several ideas going around, and some of them sort of took root, if that's the right visual imagery. And then obviously those, well, why don't you have better vocabulary than I have? So I'm just going to let you talk, Paul.
Okay, sure. I wanted readers to appreciate the fact that Black Latter-day Saints existed. And so the first 2 chapters are simply, so there's the introductory chapter, which I hope draws readers in. It starts out with a mixed racial couple who are denied temple admission in 1909 after converting to the faith. One member of this interracial couple is a former enslaved man. And they are denied admission into the temple. And yet all of their 9 children, either in life or by proxy after death, received priesthood ordination or temple admission before 1978. And so I use that family history to demonstrate the impossibility of policing racial boundaries and even defining race. What is race? I hope readers are willing to engage with that very question, because is it skin color? Is it something biological passed in the blood, as people thought in the 19th century? Or is it just simply something we have constructed in our human minds to denigrate and justify hatred, as well as genocide even of other people who don't look like us? And I think the Ritchie family demonstrates this. The descendants in the present, in the 21st century, continue to reveal African ancestry in their DNA, but they look white. And according to racial policies in place, they shouldn't have received priesthood and temple admission before 1978. And yet all the children of this mixed racial couple pass as white and receive priesthood ordination and temple admission. So, it just illustrates then the impossibility of policing racial boundaries. So with that kind of as an introduction, what I wanted readers to do is just understand that there were Black Latter-day Saints from the beginning. In my experience as a Latter-day Saint, sometimes we pretend like they only existed after 1978, and we don't talk about Black Latter-day Saints before 1978 because maybe we're uncomfortable addressing our own racism or confronting it. So the first chapter is just Black converts in the North, and then Black converts in the South. And just wanted readers to be aware that enslaved people were being baptized into the faith. In fact, we have documented at least 26, I think there are more, but record keeping was spotty, at least 26 enslaved people who were baptized into the faith before 1865, when slavery is outlawed in the nation. So enslaved at the moment of baptism, right? There were also freed Blacks who were baptized before 1865, but 26 enslaved people. So I wanted readers to just get to know a few of these people and some pretty remarkable stories, but just to recognize that sometimes one of the explanations that I hear being repeated is that the racial restrictions were just God's timing. The gospel was for white people first and then Black people. If you understand the history, then you need to recognize that that's just absolutely false. Joseph Smith claims 5 revelations which instruct him that the gospel is to be preached unto every creature. Who does every creature leave out? It's pretty explicit. The revelations of the restoration explicitly states the gospel is to be preached unto every creature. That leaves no one out. And Joseph Smith claims 2 revelations in 1831 in which he says the Lord is telling him, all flesh is mine, and I am no respecter of persons. What color of flesh is Jesus not the Savior of? And we have 2 revelations that Joseph Smith claims in 1831 in which Jesus claims all flesh is his own and declares in first-person voice, I am no respecter of persons. So we have to come to terms with, the founding revelations of the restoration. And that's one of the things I attempt to do in this little volume. And listeners should be aware, the whole sort of structure of the Let's Talk About series. These are short, accessible volumes. And, Deseret Book said, think about short chapters. And so some of the chapters are 3 and 4 pages long, but designed to move the narrative forward. But also each one, I think, built around certain pieces of evidence that help us to understand how the racial restrictions then the first part is just, hey, here's the evidence that there are no restrictions in place in the first couple of decades. And one of the pieces of evidence that I really like is an October 1840 message that the first presidency publishes in the Nauvoo newspaper, The Times and Seasons. And they are so exuberant in October of 1840 about the successes that they've had in sharing the gospel around the globe that they just kind of can't constrain themselves. So that chapter is chapter 6, and I just call it Universalism at Nauvoo. And maybe I could even just
please
share a little bit of this message that the first presidency includes in the Nauvoo newspaper, because I don't think people are aware, right? It's another piece of evidence that the racial restrictions are not in place from the beginning. So they're pretty excited about the early success of missionary work. And let me just share this opening paragraph of chapter 6. In 1840 at Nauvoo, as the first presidency contemplated the early success of missionaries gathering God's children from across the earth, they were unrestrained. Quote, if the work go forth with the same rapidity it is heretofore done, we may soon expect to see flocking to this place people from every land and from every nation. The polished European, the degraded Hottentot. And for those who aren't aware, the Hottentot was a 19th century term used to refer to Black tribal South Africans, or sometimes more generally, Black Africans, right? So the first presidency is saying, hey, the work is going so well, we expect flowing into this city before long the polished European, the degraded Hottentot, the shivering Laplander. And then they also went on to say, we anticipate, quote, persons of all languages and of every tongue and of every color who shall with us worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple and offer up their orisons in his sanctuary. An open articulation that every color would be welcome into the Nauvoo temple that they would start to build the following spring. Once again, if you want to suggest that restrictions are in place from the beginning, you're going to have to argue against the evidence because the evidence indicates otherwise. And that's just one example of the pieces of evidence in the first third, that first section of the book with open priesthood and open temples. And obviously include examples of Black Latter-day Saints, and the most well-documented priesthood holder is Elijah Abel, but also include Q. Walker Lewis, who is also an ordained elder in the Low Massachusetts branch. But Elijah Abel, because he's at the center of events, around in Ohio, he is ordained to the priesthood in January of 1836 as an elder. By the end of 1836, a member of the Third Quorum of the 70. Also in 1836, receives his washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple. So once again, just evidence upon evidence that there were no restrictions in place in the first couple of decades. And that's what that first section is designed to do, is simply lay out the evidence.
Very helpful. Keep sharing.
So then the second section is probably the more difficult section to write as well as to grapple with as readers, I think. And I hope your listeners understand, and I try to attune people to this fact in the introduction, that this is heavy history. This is heavy history. And my hope is that in engaging with it, we can lift the burden of this racism collectively, that as Latter-day Saints, when we join together collectively, we become true and living. And that my experience as a Latter-day Saint is that we do community really well. And this is one way in which we can collectively become true and living, is in helping to lift this burden. And so the second section is really the more difficult history, because that open racial vision then deteriorates across the course of the 19th century. And Brigham Young becomes concerned about race mixing amongst his followers. And by 1852, he is openly articulating a racial priesthood restriction. He does so in a couple of speeches before the Utah Territorial Legislature. And that legislature is debating what laws will govern the relationship between white enslavers and their Black enslaved people who have been brought to the territory already. There are no laws on the books governing this relationship. And it really produces, I think, a profound debate. In fact, one of the most significant debates in Latter-day Saint history, in my estimation, between Brigham Young, who is territorial governor, as well as leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, president of the church, and legislator Orson Pratt, who is also Apostle Orson Pratt. And these two men stridently disagree about what is the proper law that should be passed in this legislative session. And Brigham Young is then articulating a cursed racial identity for people of Black African descent. So ideas about slavery and race and priesthood get mingle together in Brigham Young's speeches. And Orson Pratt is speaking stridently against slavery in 19th century Utah Territory. And he's also advocating for Black male voting rights in 1852 in Utah. And so the debate between those two people produced Brigham Young's most strident articulation of a racial restriction, but also some of his most racist comments come out of that debate with Orson Pratt. And it's like I said, it's heavy history. In response to Orson Pratt suggesting that Black men should be allowed to vote, Brigham Young says we just as well give mules the right to vote as Negroes and Indians. That's all in this volume. When Deseret Book invited me to write this, I said, you have to read Brigham Young's 5th of February, 1852 speech and be aware that I will be quoting from it, or this is going nowhere. That was a condition from the beginning. And to Deseret Book's credit, they were willing to allow me to do that. I said, you can't come to me after the manuscript is written and say, you can't include that. And so I wanted them to be aware up front what that speech contained, and simply said, look, I'll be quoting from it. And it's a really difficult speech. And in that same speech, he then articulates a cursed racial identity for people of Black African descent and says they are, because Cain killed his brother Abel, they are cursed from the priesthood. And that becomes then the genesis of the racial priesthood restriction. I also deal with the Book of Abraham in the book, and how some Latter-day Saint leaders in the 19th century are drawing upon that as a racial justification for excluding priesthood. And then the chapter that you mentioned deals with Orson Pratt. Orson Pratt never accepts Brigham Young's explanation, rejects the notion that Black people are descendants of Cain. He actually says that in 1856. We have no proof, he says, that Africans are descendants of Cain. Really important that Orson Pratt, an apostle in the 19th century, rejects the only rationale Brigham Young ever gives for the racial restriction. And says, Black people are not, we have no proof that Black people are descendants of Cain. And hopefully in 2023, your listeners recognize that Orson Pratt is 100% correct. That was a long-standing idea that predated the founding of the faith and used to justify racial enslavement of Black people. That Black people are cursed descendants of Cain and also cursed descendants of Ham, and God has cursed them, and they are to be servants of servants, and that's to justify racial slavery. And that predates the founding of the faith, and yet we see Brigham Young importing those ideas into the faith and then giving them theological weight to justify racial priesthood restrictions. So Orson Pratt rejects that idea that Black people are descendants of Cain. And obviously we can think through that and unpack that in terms of the simple fact that it violates the second article of faith. Joseph Smith said we're accountable for our own sins, not for Adam's transgression. And yet Brigham Young's cursed racial restriction holds the supposed descendants of Cain accountable for a murder in which they took no part. So Orson Pratt, tragically in 1853, then comes up with an alternative explanation. Orson Hyde had previously said, well, Black skin is explainable because Black people must have, made mistakes in the premortal life, been neutral or fence-sitters. And Orson Pratt, then in 1853, will perpetuate that explanation and link it to priesthood restriction. So those are the two competing explanations that continue to exist in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all the way up to 2013, and when the First Presidency and Quorum of 12 Apostles officially disavow those two. And it's traceable then back to this debate between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young. Brigham Young rejects any notion that anyone was neutral in the premortal life, and returns immediately in 1869 back to his standard explanation that Black people are cursed descendants of Cain. And so you have those two explanations that exist all the way through the 20th century, and they originate in that debate between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young.
That's fascinating. That was completely new to me, listeners, and what caused me to lose track of time. And I encourage all of us to read that. There's several chapters in that section. Looks like from chapter 9 to chapter 16. So I encourage us all to read that and ponder that and recognize how we can do better and how we got to where we are. Were there other senior leaders of the church that were advocating to return to Joseph Smith's day? That this, and I don't know, were there other voices? Because these two voices were arguing two different points of view for the restriction. Were there other senior leaders during this same time arguing that we should go back to where Joseph Smith was?
Yeah, so what takes place, after Brigham Young kind of establishes this rationale for racial restrictions, is that each succeeding generation becomes unwilling to violate the precedent established by Brigham Young, even though Brigham Young's precedent is a violation of open racial priesthood in temples established by Joseph Smith. And so they start relying upon distant and sometimes false memories. So John Taylor, who is the leader after Brigham Young, is confronted with this question again in 1879 when Elijah Abel applies for his endowment and to be sealed to his wife, Mary Ann, who's also a Black Latter-day Saint pioneer. They raise their family in the faith, and their son Moroni is ordained to an elder in the priesthood in 1871. So even the racial restrictions play out unevenly in Elijah Abel's family. It's a deathbed ordination in 1871, but nonetheless, he's ordained to the priesthood before he passes away, Moroni Abel in Ogden in 1871. So Elijah Abel applies for his for his endowment and to be sealed to his wife, who has passed away in 1877. And so, to answer your question, it's additional evidence that the racial restrictions aren't in place from the beginning, because John Taylor, who's the leader of the faith, doesn't know what to do. Here's a Black priesthood holder, received his temple washing and anointing rituals in Kirtland, is not in Nauvoo when the endowment is introduced, and now has migrated to Utah Territory and wants the rest of his temple rituals. And the very leader of the faith is unsure what to do. So it's additional evidence that the racial restrictions aren't unambiguously in place as late as 1879, because John Taylor conducts an investigation. And he sends Joseph F. Smith to interview Elijah Abel. And Joseph F. Smith comes back and reports and says, look, he's got priesthood certificates. He's got evidence. He claimed that Joseph Smith told him that he was entitled to the priesthood and promised him all the blessings associated with it. He gave me the people who gave him his washing and anointings in Kirtland. Like Joseph F. Smith comes back with all this evidence. And John Taylor then, in thinking through this, says, well, maybe it's like some things that were done in the early days of the church and then were corrected later. So maybe Joseph Smith's open priesthood is the mistake, and Brigham Young's closed priesthood is the real policy. But he refuses to revoke Elijah Abel's priesthood. He allows it to stand, but he does not allow him entrance into the temple. So the priesthood restrictions, are growing in accumulating precedent over time. And ironically, Elijah Abel will then be called in 1883 on a third mission. So his priesthood is still valid, but he's not allowed into the temple. Joseph F. Smith actually sets him apart as a missionary in 1883. He goes back to Ohio on his third mission for the faith, returns back to Salt Lake in 1884, and dies within 2 weeks of his return. And his obituary is published in the Deseret News, and it's an atypical eulogy. It lists his priesthood ordination dates and then closes by saying he died in full faith in the gospel. I don't know who wrote his obituary, but whoever it was seemed to be sort of, writing not only for that generation, but for the ages, saying, I challenge you to deny his priesthood ordination and his devotion to his chosen faith. Were there people who said we should go back to Joseph Smith? As late as 1900, you have Lorenzo Snow, who is the leader of the faith, who says, I don't think this policy is settled. And he is having a discussion with George Q. Cannon. And in 1900, they're trying to decide, well, how much African ancestry can a person have before they should be excluded from priesthood and temples? And George Q. Cannon starts to argue for what comes to be called a one-drop policy, that even one drop of African ancestry should exclude someone. And that will be the policy in 1907. And there's a chapter in the book on the one-drop policy that illustrates the challenge of defining race, right? So leaders in Salt Lake are aware that there are several people of mixed racial ancestry who have received their temple rituals. Finally, because you have to decide each of these cases, by 1907, they simply say, okay, one drop is the policy. It's not based on worthiness. It's based on any African ancestry. Even if they look white, if we can verify African ancestry, then they're going to be excluded from priesthood and temples.
That's fascinating. I got goosebumps when you're talking about Elijah Abel and that obituary that was written for the ages, to use your language, and that all those ordinances were documented there.
Yeah, he's really remarkable. I just it's hard for me to get my head around. They don't allow. He wants to be still to the love of his life. Marianne, she's a Black Latter-day Saint pioneer as well. They're both of mixed racial ancestry, so usually defined as mulatto in census records, but nonetheless they don't ever pass as white. And he wants to be sealed. Have his love for her sealed for eternity. And it's such heartbreaking for me that he's not allowed that. And yet in 1883, he called on a third mission and goes and serves faithfully. It just kind of tugs at my heartstrings when I think about that.
Talk about phase 3 of the book, the 1978 revelation, and that's not the finish line in this space, and we're still not at the finish line.
Yeah. So, the third phase, addresses 1978, and, I just rely on that in that chapter. I just rely on President Kimball's son Edward's article that was published in BYU Studies, and it's probably the most open and closest we'll get to what was going on with President Kimball in the years leading up to the 1978 revelation. And sort of the sense that he is reaching for a revelation, that he's laying the groundwork. There was a lack of consensus amongst the leaders, and he's trying to lay the groundwork and bring about consensus, and also studying out the issue, finding no scriptural justifications, and re-examining the history, indications that he's read Lester Bush's seminal 1973 article published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, which says, look, the racial restrictions weren't in place from the beginning. There's no evidence to indicate that. And, all the historians who have looked at it since then, including myself, just reaffirm what Lester Bush published in 1973. And that includes the Joseph Smith Papers people, right? They have found no evidence. They have 10 academically trained historians working on the Joseph Smith Papers project, and they've found no evidence of Joseph Smith instigating a racial priesthood and temple restrictions. I include that, but also deliberately, Richard, I actually frame that chapter around a Black Latter-day Saint woman. Because I wanted readers to get to know Frida, Lucretia, McGee, Ballou. And a lot of times we only talk about the racial restrictions as a priesthood restriction. And I wanted readers to think about a Black woman. And so her story actually frames the 1978 Revelation chapter. She's baptized in a creek outside of Tylertown, Mississippi in 1909. And she remains faithful. She moves to New Orleans. And in 1944, she falls sick. She doesn't know that there's a branch of the church meeting in New Orleans. She subscribes to the Liahona, which is the Southern States Mission missionary magazine at the time. And she sends her tithing in to the Atlanta Mission Home. She's married a Catholic by this point. She had a first marriage, and it wasn't a happy marriage, according to her own description. Her husband did not like her faith and was not kind to her. He had children, and she waited until his children were old enough to take care of themselves, and then she divorced him. The whole time she was married to him, anytime she got a little money, she would squirrel away her tithing in her trunk outside of her husband's purview. And when she divorced him and moved back in with her parents, she said she proudly paid that tithing that she had been saving up all that time. So she then moves to New Orleans, marries the love of her life, Rudolph Ballou, and falls sick in 1944, and wrote to the mission home in Atlanta asking for elders to come and give her a blessing, but then just waits in bed. And her husband actually tracks down branch leaders in New Orleans and invites them to their home to give her a blessing. And she believes that blessing restores her health. She gets out of bed the next day and said she was fine ever since. So that's Frida. But in July of 1978, so just less than a month after the June 1978 revelation, she's traveled 1,000 miles to the Washington, D.C. temple to be sealed to the love of her life, Rudolph, who has predeceased her, sealed by proxy. And the person who stands in as proxy for Rudolph is the branch president who found her sick in bed in 1944. But why I wanted to share her story is simply because I wanted readers to appreciate the fact that she waited 69 years to be allowed into a Latter-day Saint temple. It's not just a priesthood restriction, but Black women were barred from temple admission. And Frida exemplifies that in a really profound way. She devoted her life and paid her tithing faithfully. She could answer the temple recommend questions exactly the same as a white person. And the white person would be admitted and Frida would be denied. Frida did not need to repent in 1978 to qualify for a temple recommend, in other words. But the church she loved perhaps did. And within 1 month of that 1978 revelation, she is in the Washington, D.C. temple, and she refers to that day as the happiest day of her life. And she does so in a talk that she gives at New Orleans State Conference in 1982. She calls that day that she was sealed to her beloved Rudolph the happiest day of her life. And if you appreciate the fact that she waited 69 years to get into a Latter-day Saint temple, I think it becomes really compelling for us to understand the implications of that 1978 revelation. It's one thing to understand it from the perspective of the white male leaders, but I wanted readers to understand it from the perspective of a faithful Black Latter-day Saint woman.
Well, that brought me to tears, and probably a bunch of our listeners and readers of the book. What a wonderful style of writing as a historian. But then that seems to be one of your gifts to our community, is with the database, is bringing life to readers. Stories change our hearts, Paul, and they help us develop compassion and empathy and understanding. And when you talk about 7 decades, as somebody has a testimony of the temple, pays tithing, that helps me better understand that this wasn't just Black men, and that this is Black Latter-day Saints. Love to have you talk more about Phase 3. I've got some questions for you. I don't know if you want to hear questions or want to talk more about Phase 3 of your book.
Okay, so let me just respond to what you said, Richard, because you identified one of the things that I hoped to be able to do in this book, and this, I think the timing of it, the fact that we have a couple of years of Century of Black Mormons and the biographies allowed me to include those stories so that exactly what you said, Richard. I'm just trying to emphasize the point that you just made, because I think it's really important. Histories of the racial restrictions, including my own, tend to talk about them and deal with them from a white, administrative, male perspective. And there are reasons for that. That's where the sources are. And we need to understand those decisions and the decision-making process, right? But because of the Century of Black Mormons database, in this volume, I was able to include, well, what are the ramifications of those decisions in the lives of actual Black Latter-day Saints? And to me, that's the important aspect of this volume, is that it shows us how it played out in individual lives and unevenly in various different Black Latter-day Saint lives. And I hope then, like you mentioned, that readers can come to identify with these individuals. It's not just distant policy decisions, but it's actual, real, and up close lives of Black Latter-day Saints, and what the implications were. So that was all just to say I'm glad that came through, because that was the hope. And the Century of Black Mormons database allowed that to happen. And so it's also a shout out to all of the wonderful people who have worked, to make that possible with Century of Black Mormons.
Thank you.
So, and then for the third part, happy to just answer questions for the third part of the book. Yeah.
And this may be in your book, but if it's not, tell us about Bruce R. McConkie after this 1978 revelation, what he said at BYU.
Yeah, it is. It is in the book. So it's chapter 18, and I can just read that first paragraph. So within months of the June 1978 revelation, Elder Bruce R. McConkie spoke at Brigham Young University. Quote, "It doesn't make a particle of difference what anybody ever said about the Negro matter before the first day of June of this year," he announced. "Forget everything that I have said or what President Brigham Young or George Buchanan or whomsoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with a limited understanding and without the light and knowledge that has now come into the world." And so I use that talk that he gave at Brigham Young to then start to grapple with post-revelation justifications. So he sort of says that to the BYU audience, but nonetheless, we have come up with a variety of justifications after the 78 revelation to try to justify and explain it away, rather than, in my estimation, the required work to root out racism. We come up with excuses and justifications rather than doing the work that it requires to root it out.
Talk more about that.
Yeah, so like I said, it's difficult history, and so we like to come up with explanations that kind of stand in or explain away the racial restrictions, and I deal with some of those in that chapter. I share an experience I had in 2010 in my own congregation, just teaching deacons quorum. The lesson one Sunday was on the attributes of God. And the lesson manual stipulated that one of the attributes of God is that God is no respecter of persons. And so talking to these 12-year-old deacons, just trying to unpack what that meant. And one of the 12-year-old deacons raised his hand and said, well, if God is no respecter of persons, then why did he curse Black people with black skin? And this is a person who had grown up completely in a post-1978 church. There were no racial restrictions in place, and yet still had come to believe that black skin is a result of a curse from God. So it became evident to me that going silent was not the right approach, right? That it wasn't working. If the tactic was, okay, we'll just let those old teachings die out, we'll go silent on them, and within a generation, everything will be hunky-dory. This gave me firsthand evidence that that's not the case. Going silent doesn't solve the issue. We have to actively unteach the falsehoods that were previously taught. We have to proactively say black skin is not a curse. We have to proactively teach that Black people are not descendants of Cain or of Ham or of Canaan. We have to completely disavow, but also teach. It has to be in the curriculum. It has to be repeated. We spent 130 years teaching those false ideas. We have to take 130 years and be committed to unteaching them, right? To eradicate it. And instead of justifying and explaining away, what if we owned it, right? So I try to grapple with that in the last section of the book. I deal with, we already addressed the notion, white people first and then Black people in parallel to Jews first and then Gentiles. So I addressed that. The tribe of Levi explanation also has come to stand in as, a way of trying to explain the racial restrictions. And I addressed that. The notion that, everyone was racist back then, so that's just how it was. I addressed that. Joseph Smith was a product of the 19th century, and he sanctioned priesthood ordination. So, he's a product of his cultural milieu. Can't just simply say, well, Brigham Young is a product of his time and didn't know any better, right? There were those who were advocating for full Black racial equality in the 19th century. So it's not what historians call presentism, right? We shouldn't superimpose a present on the past. It's not presentism to hold them accountable to the standards of their day. Actually, it's an invitation to understand the standards of their day, and racism was racism even in the 19th century. There were those who were advocating for full Black equality. Orson Pratt advocating for Black voting rights in Utah Territory in 1852, and he's a product of the 19th century. So you can't just simply dismiss it as, oh, everyone was racist back then. Another justification that I hear is that, well, treating Black people equally would have brought down the church. And I address that explanation or justification in that chapter as well. So try to work through some of the ways that we continue to try to dismiss and excuse rather than do the work that it requires to root out racism.
I've heard the third one the most in my lifetime, and I'm glad you addressed that. And I'll probably, after the recording the podcast, read that chapter of your book, which I've never done after a podcast. It's such a fascinating topic for me. I've written down, there's some people that would say this was still God's plan, Paul, that Brigham Young reflected God's will for the church during this time. And there are other faithful Latter-day Saints says, no, this wasn't God's plan for the church. It was never meant to be a racial or temple ban. Do you want to talk about that? Is it okay for Latter-day Saints to fall in either camp, or do you really feel like, if you really understand the history, you need to fall in a certain camp? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, if your listeners, those who read the book, it will be clear what camp I'm in, and I say it explicitly in the book, and Deseret Book just asked me to be clear. I'm speaking only for myself, and I say that in the book. I'm speaking only for myself, but I'm hoping that readers will actually engage with the evidence. So the evidence is laid out in the structure of the book, but also the actual documents that I quote and that story that I tell. Brigham Young never claims a revelation. There's no revelation that anyone can point to for the origins of the racial restrictions. And so really, what it boils down to is sort of following the evidence. And in my view, there is no evidence that the racial restrictions are of divine origins. I can trace how they became entrenched over time, and I do that in this short little volume. How do we go from open priesthood in temples to segregated priesthood in temples? How do they become solidified over time? And it's just, brick after brick after brick, you create this wall of exclusion. And that's what the evidence is. And by the early 20th century, then leaders are falsely remembering back and simply saying, well, the restrictions have been in place from the beginning. And that begins under Joseph F. Smith. So, that becomes the narrative they believe. I believe, that they are sincere in that belief. They haven't gone back and investigated, right? And so it takes time to unwind that existing narrative. So, if we're going to root out racism, then we have to grapple with that narrative and where the evidence leads us. And I say in this book, I don't believe it's of divine origins. And the question from my deacon really gets at the heart of the issue, right? The restrictions would then violate the very nature of godhood. God is no respecter of persons. Christ says that twice in 1831 to Joseph Smith. I am no respecter of persons. It violates the scriptural standards established. Reads 2 Nephi 26, the entire chapter, not just all are like unto God, but the entire chapter. So anything that is in violation with, the standard works really becomes the issue. And I deal with that in that third section, right? Like, how do we reconcile this? How do we make sense of it? And Deseret Book actually asked me to do that. Like, walk us through how you do that as a scholar, but also as a believer. And so those final chapters are just a chapter by chapter sort of way of thinking through it. And I'm just trying to open up my thought process. Some people, are not going to agree with me, but I'm just laying out, how I see this. So, chapter 19, agency in the gospel plan. If black skin is not a curse, why did God allow Brigham Young and other leaders to teach that it was? That's a question I deal with in that chapter. In my estimation, agency lies at the heart of the question. Chapter 20, if the restrictions were wrong, if they were out of harmony with modern and ancient scripture, how do we square them with President Wilford Woodruff's promise that the Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray? I address the hard questions. Maybe, everyone's not maybe going to be on board with where I come down on this, but Deseret Book asked me to do that. And the fact that, they published this is credit to them and what they're trying to do with this series. Chapter 21, how do we reconcile what Brigham Young said in 1852, that this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain? I know they are. I know they cannot bear rule in the priesthood, with the fact that Jesus Christ twice declared in 1831, I am no respecter of persons. And I deal with that question in that chapter. And the final chapter is just a path forward. Like, how do we move forward with this very heavy history? I am very clear where I land on that question. And I think it is counterintuitive to have the leader of our faith calling us to lead out in abandoning prejudice and then not fully grapple with, do we recognize that Frida can answer the temple recommend questions the exact same as a white person and be denied admission, not based on worthiness, based on skin color? That's called racism. Are we willing to actually understand what that means and what the policies actually look like in practice? So then that leads me to the conclusion: if God is no respecter of persons, these did not originate with him. That violates his very being as a God.
Just deeply moved listening to you, Paul. For me, this is faith building and needed work in our community, and especially I'm 61. But some ways I see the church through millennial eyes and Gen Z's eyes, your students' eyes, and they want to talk about these complicated issues. And they need people with a grounded voice like yours, a historian, somebody who believes, to talk about that. So I'm grateful for Deseret Book. I think we do better when we talk about these subjects versus not. So this is really needed work. I hope that local leaders, ward councils, fifth elders, quorums, and relief societies think about talking about this in a fifth Sunday. It gives parents better tools to answer their kids' questions. If you've got younger kids coming up, it gives you tools to help your deacon understand what the church teaches. Some would say, Paul, this has never been we sometimes have this debate about doctrine versus policy, and some would sort of say, well, this was not a big deal because it was never doctrine. It was just a policy, and our doctrine never changes. So there's really nothing here that is earth-shattering. Any thoughts on that sort of thinking?
Yeah. those words play out amongst Latter-day Saints in a variety of ways. I mean, doctrine, if you look at its definition, is simply teaching. That's what it means. And when you belong to a faith that claims as one of the tenets of its faith that we believe in continuing revelation, then you got to expect change. It's just foundational to who we are as Latter-day Saints. So it gets really difficult in terms of the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions. I'm going to try to answer it this way. So President McKay does say to Sterling McMurrin, this is a policy, not a doctrine. That's a conclusion that he arrives at. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't taught as doctrine at points in Latter-day Saint history. And one of the chapters I deal with, I'm just going to flip to it really quickly, that we have to sort of come to terms with, is that there was a book published in 1959, called Mormon Doctrine. So if you're trying to say, well, it wasn't taught as doctrine, you have to grapple with the fact that it was included in a book called Mormon Doctrine, which continued to be sold up until 2010, defining Black people as cursed. So, it's pretty hard to escape that uncomfortable truth. And I deal with that in chapter 15 of the book. And maybe I can just read maybe a little section there. Let's see. Just to give an indication of what was included in Mormon doctrine, right? So it doesn't give us a lot of wiggle room if we just try to say, oh, well, that was just a policy, simply because a very popular book called Mormon Doctrine included these racial teachings, codified them, and solidified them in encyclopedic form in this book. So I'll just share a little bit from chapter 15. Adding to the doctrinal error of the restrictions, 4 years later, Elder Bruce R. McConkie, then a member of the First Council of the 70, published a popular and authoritatively titled book, Mormon Doctrine. In it, he included entries on Cain, Ham, Negroes, and what he called a divinely ordered caste system. His explanations on those subjects helped to codify racial teachings as well as extend the corresponding restrictions forward. As a result of his rebellion, Cain was cursed with a dark skin, McConkie wrote. He became the father of the Negroes and those spirits who are not worthy to receive the priesthood or are born through his lineage. And then I go through and trace the different iterations over time. He does change some of the entries in 1979 after the revelation, doesn't change the case system entry, and there's still then published up through 2010 when it's finally pulled from the shelves, the notion that Black people are cursed descendants of Cain. So under the title Mormon Doctrine. So you can debate policy versus doctrine, but you have to confront the fact that those teachings were codified in a book called Mormon Doctrine.
Thank you. I would think I could ask you any question about this space and it wouldn't be a new question to you. You haven't spent hundreds of hours thinking about researching, and just so grateful for your voice. Listeners, sometimes I'll hear things in Sunday school like our doctrine has never changed and it will never change. And I just feel different. My faith as a Latter-day Saint is our doctrine has changed. If Paul could do this better than me, perhaps go through 10 things that we taught as doctrine because they were our teachings and changed. And I think our doctrine can continue to change. And I don't advocate for changes in doctrine. I think the pattern, it comes through our leaders. And so I support that pattern, but it may be a more sustainable approach for Latter-day Saints to believe our doctrine has changed and will continue to change. And and it's an ongoing restoration as we better match what I would call the pure gospel of Jesus Christ that we're still trying to perfectly match with our restored church. I love when you were on our earlier podcast, you really shifted me on something because you, and I think I wrote this in my second book about improving Latter-day Saint culture, is you didn't want to be cast as an unfaithful Latter-day Saint because you didn't think the priesthood restrictions were from God. And maybe, do you want to talk more about that? Is just, there are probably more and more that feel like this wasn't from God. And if they open up in church or a family, some would say, well, you're on the slippery slope to apostasy. You're not fully in the church. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about creating space in Zion for people that don't believe this is from God?
Yeah. That's what makes this topic and this discussion sort of personal, is because I've experienced that, in my own faith journey, and it stings, Richard. I'll be frank, but to call someone's faith into question because they articulate that, and now I've articulated it very publicly. I articulated it in a book published by Deseret Book, in fact, to suggest then that a person who subscribes to that position is somehow doesn't have faith. In fact, I've read the evidence. I've looked at the documents. I've spent a decade in the archives. This is the evidence that I've returned with. This is the evidence that I've found. And you think it doesn't take faith? You think it doesn't take faith to look at this evidence and be a believer? So I think it takes profound faith. And I think we should think about ways that we can be inclusive of, people who might think differently than us, who might look differently than us, who might vote differently than us. That's what Zion is supposed to look like. We are unified in our devotion to Jesus Christ. That's why I show up on Sunday, because I'm there to partake of the bread of sinners and promise to follow him the following week. And when I mess up, I'm going to be back again next Sunday, looking for hope in Jesus Christ. And that is what I hope this book can help people think through, is how can we be unified and inclusive amidst our diversity? That's the call. That's the call to build a Latter-day Zion. That's what it means to be a Christian disciple. And in the final chapter, maybe I can just read a little section there. In a revelation to Joseph Smith in 1831, Jesus Christ offers us a way to, claim all flesh as our own. And let every man esteem his brother as himself and practice virtue and holiness before me. D&C 38:24. We are called as a disciple of Christ to esteem our brother as ourself and practice virtue and holiness. So that's my calling as a disciple, to esteem my brothers and sisters as myself. However, if we imagine our brothers and sisters to be only people who look like us, we are missing the point. To esteem our brothers and sisters as ourselves is a call to recognize the diversity that exists among us, to see color, and to do the work that it takes to understand what life looks like from someone else's perspective. And I'm going to skip a little bit, but I close just quoting Samuel Chambers. Samuel Chambers was 13 in 1844 when he was baptized. He was enslaved at age 13, and he's baptized. There's no organized branch anywhere around him. He continues to be a one-person congregation, nursing a spark of faith. He's enslaved and can't gather with the Latter-day Saints. He waits 20 years until the Civil War ends and he survives, and then saves up money for 5 years to be able to gather to the Great Basin. And he arrives with his wife, Amanda, in 1870. Can you imagine being baptized at age 13 and whatever it was that you identified with this faith, you nursed that without any nourishment, without any Book of Mormon, without any missionaries, and are so convinced that after the Civil War ends and you gain your freedom, you're going to save your money for 5 years to be able to immigrate to Salt Lake? He becomes an unordained deacon in the Salt Lake 8th Ward. Remarkably, the deacons in the 19th century are adults, right? And they take care of meeting houses, and they have monthly meetings. And there's actually a clerk in this stake who records the testimonies at those monthly deacon meetings. And so we have Samuel Chambers' words. And he continuously exhorts his fellow deacons. He says, some people say it's small to be a deacon. I say there's nothing small in the kingdom of God. A formerly enslaved man, an unordained deacon, going to deacon's quorum meeting, participating, and constantly reminding and urging for unity. And I closed the book with Samuel Chambers. And what I'm trying to suggest here, Richard, is just like, this is my answer to your question in terms of, can we be inclusive? Can we include ideas, people, perspectives that might not match our own? And can we expand then our own perspectives by being confronted with ideas that maybe we hadn't considered before? That's when real learning takes place, in my estimation. And it's our obligation to create those kind of safe spaces for that kind of learning to take place, because I think we become closer to Christ in the process. So I'll just close with this. In 1874, the formerly enslaved man Samuel Chambers served in the office of deacon in the Salt Lake 8th Ward, even though he was not ordained. His vision of a Zion society was one of unity and inclusion amid diversity, a model for the 21st century. He reminded his fellow deacons that the gospel is not only to the Gentiles, but also to the African, for I am of that race. The knowledge I received is from God, he declared. I pray that we may be as one to build up the kingdom of God, he pled in a supplication that reverberates to the present and invites us all to join him in the work of inclusion. And I gave Samuel Chambers the final word because it's such a profound plea from the 19th century, from a formerly enslaved man who served as deacon, unordained, in the Salt Lake 8th Ward. That's the message that I think can help to heal our hearts and bridge the gap between us and, whatever other position that someone might have. This plea for inclusion and unity amid our diversity. That's what Zion looks like in my estimation. And that's the church I want to belong to, the one articulated by Samuel Chambers.
Well, you brought me to tears again. For Samuel Chambers to be the concluding voice of your book, it's just beautiful. It would be unimaginable to him that this book exists, that where we are, maybe it was hoped or believed, then your ability to bring his voice as the concluding voice is deeply moving. Listeners, when just act on the impressions you felt during Paul's podcast. I know I had an experience doing podcasts with Black Latter-day Saints, and I remember feeling pretty uncomfortable a couple times, and I've learned to sit with that uncomfortableness. And in the past, I probably would say, well, that's just the Spirit leaving. And now I don't say that anymore. I try to figure out what's going on here. And often I recognize that uncomfortableness is really the changes I need to make. And in this case, we're listening to Black Latter-day Saints, the racism that's still present, in my view, and the uncomfortableness of being confronted with that, but then the work I need to do to help us be a more Zion-like people and the personal repentance. So if you hear things in Paul's podcast or read things in the book, you may feel some of those feelings. I don't feel those now, but I did a little bit. Just sit with that a little bit and give yourself some grace, because maybe there was no malice intended on your part. You didn't decide one day to hold views from the past that you just didn't realize we don't teach anymore, but use that as just personal repentance. And I'm not at the finish line. Don't think I'm at the finish line, but I'm willing to learn and grow, because I want to lift the burdens and help create Zion, the Zion that Samuel talked about. Greenflake is somebody that you're probably aware of. I don't know if he made it in the book, but we may have Molly Bonner on the podcast someday to talk about Greenflake, an enslaved pioneer and member of the church. And Molly Bonner found press to create a movie about him that was released last year. Molly, if you're listening, we got to get you on the podcast to connect listeners with that movie you produced. I read a church tweet about Black History Month, Paul, and you may need to go because you're commuting home. And I was grateful the church tweeted about Black History Month, but the responses discouraged me. Some of the responses were, well, I'll only label as a child of God. So why should we be talking about this group of people? And I don't know what the vocabulary is, but I don't know why we do that. And I don't know if there's a term that you would use that some people would use to just dismiss sort of labeling people. To me, our primary label is a child of God, but we have other labels that are needed. Do you want to talk about why people would do that and why that's not a good thing to do? And I realize you didn't, I'm paraphrasing some of the responses, but I'm sure you're familiar with this narrative.
Yeah. Some people see this as a zero-sum game. Instead of thinking expansively, sometimes we think sort of a scarcity mentality, right? And somehow that celebrating Black History Month somehow means that other history is somehow excluded. It's not quite clear to me, but it's sort of the zero-sum game kind of mentality. And, Jesus Christ claims all flesh as his own, and asking us to actually engage and be disciples of Christ. Like I mentioned before, we're asked to esteem our brothers and sisters as ourselves. And if we're only thinking of our brothers and sisters as people who look like us, we're missing the point. So the call for unity and inclusion amid our diversity is a willingness to acknowledge that other people's experiences might be different from ours. And rather than getting defensive, actually be willing to sit and listen, like you just articulated, Richard, willing to consider that because I grew up with lighter skin than someone else, my life experiences might be different. And I should be willing to try to understand their life experiences and understand what their life might look like because their skin color might be darker than mine. And how did that lead them to have different experiences than I have had? And rather than become defensive, we are called to esteem our brothers and sisters as ourselves and to practice virtue and holiness in doing so. Becoming defensive and pretending like celebrating Black History Month means somehow I'm getting left out isn't following that counsel. That's not being a disciple of Christ. So obviously, Black History Month is about correcting past wrongs. And addressing the narratives that were largely left out of the way that we told the American story. It's, largely, the 1970s when America confronts its loss in Vietnam, that we start to see different narratives emerging in terms of textbooks and how we tell our very own story. It's largely a triumphal narrative of white progress. And then historians started to say, well, what does this triumphal narrative look like if we understand it from the perspective of African Americans, or the perspective of Native Americans, or Asian Americans, or Latino, Latinas, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Look at the way that we were included or excluded from textbooks. A major religious tradition endured a state-sanctioned extermination order in Missouri in 1838. So do you want your narrative included? Do you want your narrative represented? Then why would you be upset at someone else's narrative being represented and included? It's all a part of this broader story, right? And it's a way of trying to be inclusive, to correct past mistakes. It's not a zero-sum game. If we tell Black history, doesn't mean that we can't tell other history too. So I think it requires maybe a bit of a way of rethinking, and I see it play out, like you said, in social media, and the best book that addresses it, and The Sum of Us is the book that I'm trying to think of, and it's fantastic. It sort of deals with this history in the 20th century. So after Brown versus Board of Education, when things across the nation started to become integrated rather than segregated, white controlled municipal governments, for example, started to cover over swimming pools. No one will be able to go swimming in public swimming pools if we have to swim with Black people. So we will deprive our white children the opportunity of a swimming pool if it means we have to swim with Black people. That's the zero-sum game that I'm talking about. And you end up hurting yourself, right? You end up hurting your own white children, preventing them from having a public swimming pool. You'd rather pave it over than allow them to swim with Black people. So you're willing to actually destroy opportunities for your own children rather than give it to everyone. So you think scarcity mentality versus abundance mentality. Hey, there's enough water for all of us to swim in, and we all get to enjoy the same pool. What harm does that do? Right? So I think, The Sum of Us is a fantastic book that sort of walks us through the way that it's not a zero-sum game, even though it gets defined that way and plays out that way. Well, if Black people get this, what about white people? Right? That's sort of the knee-jerk response that sometimes I see playing out. It's just the exact wrong way of approaching it. Have to overcome any sort of notion that there's only a certain amount of freedom to go around, or a certain amount of love of Jesus Christ to go around. It's endless, it's abundant, and the Book of Mormon defines the atonement of Jesus Christ as infinite. So what color of flesh is he unable to save, in other words? We have to just end the zero-sum game kind of mentality, in my estimation.
listeners, I'm a real fan of historians. I haven't really noticed that about me. I'm not a historian. Just on a personal, I remember taking a class in the 1970s, late 70s as a U of U student. I'm a business major, but somehow I got an American history class. It was a black man. I can't remember his name anymore, but he taught American history at the University of Utah. And
it's probably my colleague, Dr. Ronald Coleman.
That's who it is. That is him. I learned so much. I was just drawn to him. And I'm emotional again because it's been so many years since he is the only professor I can remember, a marketing professor that I can remember from my experience at the U of U. And I just loved his passion. And he probably helped me to understand the role of a black man, and that he's this capable, incredibly educated. Sounds like he's alive and he's a colleague.
He's retired now, but yes, he's very much alive, and I still talk to him. He's fantastic. Yeah, a really good friend.
And my older brother is a historian. He teaches at the University of Oregon. Jeff Osler, he's the author of Surviving Genocide, which is, I think, you're probably familiar with that book, Paul, one of the fine books about Native Americans. You mentioned that, and understanding our history there. My missionary companion in England from 1980s, Darren Perry. You would know Darren, who is a Shoshone Native American and talks about his experience and brings voice to that. And so I love, and my favorite historian that I see on the TV, I kind of a crush on her, Paul, is Doris Kearns Goodwin. I actually Googled her age. I was curious how old she is. She's in her 80s, but whenever she comes on cable TV, I love her historical perspective as a presidential historian. And listeners, I think historians have a real role to reduce the divisiveness because they can take us back to historical lessons and things that we've learned that perhaps we don't need to make the same mistakes again. And understanding the history of Black Latter-day Saints, Black Americans, Native Americans, I think helps us understand how we can do better, and helps us, as we are aware of these stories, I think it helps us atone and want to do better. So that's a plug for historians in general and their role in our community. And all of you that are current historians or thinking that as a career path, you contribute quite a bit to our community, and I'm grateful for your work. In the show notes, listeners, we'll link to this book. We'll link to the database that we've talked about. We'll link to Paul's prior episode, 278, if you want to link to that. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners, Paul, before we sign off?
No, I mean, it's been a real honor, Richard. And I should have said this earlier when you mentioned Molly. I completely endorse, bring Molly on. He's fantastic. Would be a fantastic guest on your show, and it really wonderful, Latter-day Saint and in his devotion, and also trying to bring about change in terms of the way that we understand Latter-day Saint racial past. He's fantastic. But it's been a real honor to talk with you again, Richard. I really love the work that you do.